Finally, we're getting into sustainable design, and all of you have been waiting so long and so patiently to get through the theory and get more into what we would consider architecture or the built environment. So we're going to actually take a look at some of these ideas. I like to start with the historical context or review of where we've gone in the course. I do recommend you go back and watch all the videos before this, but we can see each age has been dominated by an energy type, and there's an associated expression of architecture. I say that form follows worldview. Yes, I trademarked that yesterday, so you can't use that. And throughout history, you see as our energy sources change, as our worldview shifts, we begin to see different kinds of architecture. I'm going to take you through those briefly. But there's just sort of the taxonomy of all the different things and how they line up with the different worldviews. So if you think about the age of the hunter-gatherer, it's funny when people use the word primitive, because if I set any of you out in this, who are taking this class to try to build one of these so-called primitive huts, you couldn't do it. You wouldn't have the knowledge of the local materials. You wouldn't know how to connect them. So if you think about the architecture of that time, it was actually was and still is very sophisticated. It just doesn't look sophisticated based on our current worldviews. Many people still build this way and have maintained that craft. Certainly the pyramids were built to very exacting standards, and were really an example of a symmetrical architecture, of a hierarchical architecture that reflected the times of that period, of that worldview. Then we went into the early industrial worldview, where we began to classify nature and began to dominate nature. And you can see the technological expressions become more sophisticated, the building of the domes and the arches. We're starting to see the use of technology emerge in architecture in a tension as opposed to just compression. And finally, we get to modernism in the late age of industry, and you see Villa Savoy. I'm sorry, I have horrible French. But here we're looking at something that has these tiny, tiny, tiny small columns, right? These big structural elements that go over here that are hidden away. It's a totally different architectural expression that is indicative of the kinds of worldviews that were in play at that time. And then I'm a postmodernist guy. I went to architecture school when these were the kind of buildings that we were drawing on yellow trace. And the worldview at that time was really about the understanding of history again, and understanding the value of history and reinterpreting it. It didn't last long, and probably because of buildings like this, it probably shouldn't have lasted long. And finally, now we're moving into the age of agriculture, which is pretty exciting. So we're beginning to see buildings that are non-orthogonal, yet very structurally strong. So this is actually the minimum amount of material you would need to build this building. So in a sense, that's a very sustainable way of doing it. You're seeing the advantages of computational dynamics and the ability to make structures that are non-orthogonal, which may more come into being. And I was thinking about the juxtaposition of these two structures. If you think about the full circle or the second awareness, we've come a long way in terms of our relationship to nature, and we're now beginning to reconnect. And I'm not surprised to see the architecture changing shape and form to be, biomimetic or biophilic, or any of the terms that you'd like to use for an architecture that's more connected to nature, because that is, in a sense, our emerging worldview. Wow, that almost made sense, didn't it? So here's the full circle. We started back in the archaic days, and we went through this long loop of different kinds of worldviews, and now we've returned back to create another time when we're thinking about nature again in a very direct way. As a review of integral theory, we have the four perspectives: the subjective, we have the objective, which is the measurements of objects in time and space. We have our shared values, our cultural understanding of space, for example, and then the systems that actually generate how those things function. So that's actually very big on function. And as a sustainable designer, the purpose of this lecture is to get you to understand that you have to work in all four perspectives simultaneously. I know people, for example, who are great at doing high performative buildings, but they're terrible to look at and terrible to use. Now, Mark Takei has interpreted integral theory into these four, what I would call mantras or directives or perspectives that we would follow in terms of sustainable design. And if I could just go through this again, there's subjective and objective ways of thinking about buildings and architecture and landscape architecture and interiors. And certainly there is meaning in architecture and design, and there is experience in that. And so we have the I, it, we, and it's there, and then now we can talk about experience. Now, one of the great shames of architecture in the last 100 years or so is we've become visually dominated. That if we really want to engender experience, if we want to make memories, we have to engage all the senses, including smell, touch, sound. All of these things come together to help us get a phenomenological experience. It actually helps us to create memories. But if we just make a beautiful building, I really question whether that building is by its own beauty would be sustainable. I'm really interested in maximizing performance to the point where our buildings and interiors and landscapes are actually helping to improve the environment in a measurable way. And I'm certainly interested in meaning and how meaning plays a role in design, and we'll talk about how we can do that. And finally, the systems, or as Mark Takei says, guiding the flow. And this is what we typically call passive design, where we're thinking about where the wind and sun and water is moving and how we can manifest that or make that work in a particular project. So integral sustainable design acts as directives to the design team. We can maximize performance, for example. As one begins to imagine the goals of design, IST helps to frame a holistic approach, which captures system thinking, but a lot more, right? So here we're getting a holistic view of what sustainable design can be. Now I'm going to take you through the 4 quadrants one by one and give you a sense of integral sustainable design and how it can play out in building an overall approach to sustainable design that I think is very valuable and very effective. And the first quadrant is Engender Experience. And here we're looking at the phenomenology of space. How do I feel in space? How do I connect to the natural cycles? What are the visual aesthetics of green design? Is it always a green roof or a green living wall? We don't really know yet. It's still emerging, but this is only how we experience space. It has no cultural layer on top of it, and it is completely within that realm, and it's important to understand that. As an example, here's a beautiful corridor, at least I think it's beautiful. And obviously the rhythm of the columns, the proportion of the columns, the curvature of those arches, all of these things combine to create a certain kind of visual experience in space. But looking at the materials, I see a certain kind of texture. I have a feeling that the sounds are very echoing. I have a feeling that the smells are a little bit damp or musty because of the type of material. And I love how the light, you know that the sun, you know there's an opening at the end of that corridor down there. I really want to walk down to the end of that corridor. And this is how architects and designers play out space and encourage people to move through space. If I tell you all of a sudden that this is a church, then all of a sudden you have a cultural overlay and you may begin to think differently. So for example, this is Ronchamp by Le Corbusier, which is really a great example of how experience and how the manipulation of light can drive the type of kind of experience that someone have in space. And clearly this is a masterpiece. People come from all over the world to experience this building. Clearly, though, this can't be the beginning and end of architecture. There's got to be other things that are happening. So I would ask, for example, what is the performance of that building? Is it a net zero energy building? Probably not. Does it matter? Maybe. If my goal is to have a zero impact on the environment or even regenerate the environment, I know that beauty and experience has to be only one of the variables in the generation of design. So I'm looking at net zero water, net zero energy. I'm looking at high performance buildings. I'm going to use the LEED rating system here. All of these are very valuable experiences. So for example, in this quadrant, we can measure the quality of a building empirically through different kinds of experiments or measurements. So I can do building performance modeling, and I can fill out a LEED check sheet, and I can tell you what the performative aspects of the building are. We know that a LEED building doesn't equal a good building. No one in this course is trying to make that claim. In fact, if we look at LEED from an integral perspective, we notice that all of the points tend to be up here in the upper right category because that's the measurable category, right? So LEED is quite clearly positioning themselves up here. They're not claiming to lead to good architecture, and they're not even claiming to lead to sustainability, by the way. They're actually claiming that it's a green building metric system that we can use to help us lead to high performance. So, but there's the point being is that it's really a performative aspect. If we move to the lower right, or the guide flow, we can begin to look at this idea of fitness to site and context. How does a building fit into its context? How does the landscape integrate with its larger landscapes around it? How are the flows of water, of air, of light manipulated on site to create the most effective project that we can have? What's a living building? We'll be getting into that in a moment. So for example, let's just go forward here. Here's an example of a project by Andrew Pogon Landscape Architects and Karen Timberlake, Sidwell Friends, and the idea here is that we have a naturalized water purification system right here at the entry to the building. They call it a biology pond. So as toilet flushed waters are coming in here, it's systematically cleaned through a natural process, and it becomes a visual element within the landscape of the project. It's pretty cool, actually. So that's a systems understanding of that project. And I can look at that in section. I can also see, well, hey, you know what? That's probably pretty cool looking too. The idea that a swamp, in quotes, actually has great intrinsic value in terms of ecosystems, but also could be quite beautiful at the same time. At the same time, we're also looking to generate projects that have meaning. So what is the social, cultural impact of projects? And all of these organizations spend all of their time trying to get people to build buildings in a certain way that benefits society as a whole. In other words, there's an ethical content or ethical foundation to sustainable design that is generally understood as good, but maybe for some people gets in the way. So, for example, LEED for many architects and designers is considered a nuisance or a necessary evil. And that's telling me that they haven't yet fully adopted a 4-quadrant approach to sustainable design, because if they had, that would be pretty clear. The Architecture 2030 group is another example of thinking about the good of society for the future. There's plenty of other groups there you can see. So I want to be clear here that integral sustainable design is actually focusing on the overall quality of reality, which we as designers have a huge responsibility for. And that quality of reality can be measured in many ways. So for example, we can think about form follows function. We can think about ecological design. We can think about how buildings and landscapes and interiors function from a circulation systems point of view, from a mechanical systems point of view, from a technical systems point of view. But ultimately, if we're to persist as a species, ecology tends to be the one that trumps all other ones in terms of sustainable design. And certainly, we can pursue high performance design, and we should pursue it. And so we can say form follows performance. I also like form follows feeling. If it's not beautiful, it's not sustainable. I would challenge you to think in multiple senses beyond just the visual. And finally, and what I think drives most of this is form follows worldview. And we were moving into a new worldview where social responsibility and concern for the environment are taking more and more precedence over some of the other things that we would typically consider in the design process. So this is really the end of this lecture on integral sustainable design. What we plan to do next is to give you a couple examples of some highly performing buildings, landscape interiors, which might actually be considered to be authentically sustainable. And I'm looking forward to you joining me for that.